If you do not want to appear in the in the video, you can switch off your camera as well. And then all chats, we would like to reserve the questions to the end, so you can drop all your questions in the chat, and we will try to answer all of them. So I'm going to start now. My name is Eleanor Sarpong. I'm the Deputy Director and Policy Lead for the Alliance for Affordable Internet. If you're not aware of us, we are the leading advocate for affordable internet globally. We are an initiative of the World Wide Web Foundation, which is the foundation that was set up by Sir Timothy Lee and his wife, Rosemary Lee. And we have been advocating for affordable and meaningful connectivity for some time now. And we have been ardent supporters of making sure that everyone around the world is connected to an internet that is meaningful. We work in various countries through coalitions, and we work through coalitions that bring together civil society, private sector, and the public sector as well, academia, and all forms of NGOs, in order to discuss and look at policy and regulatory reforms. And we do that underpinned by very strong original research. And so without much ado, I'm going to introduce today's topic and why it's very important. Now, globally, over 50% of the world continues to be unconnected. I mean, the number has been steadily declining, but then COVID-19 happened. And what that meant that a lot of people who were on the progress of being connected now saw themselves falling behind. A lot of public spaces that were hitherto opened for connectivity were now closed because of the pandemic. So we see a lot of inequalities in the digital space, and infrastructure is a key component of that. According to research conducted by us, A4AI, in partnership with the ITU, we need $428 billion in infrastructure investment to connect the world with universal access in the next 9 years. Although there's growth in subsea cables and middle line technologies, the last mile connectivity, that is the leg of the connectivity that comes from the backhaul to the home of the premises, continues to lag. That is why we need to explore options. We've seen a growth in TV-wide spaces, low Earth orbit constellations such as SpaceX, OneWeb, Telesat, and others. But how sustainable are these? In the last few weeks, we heard about the closure of Google's Project Loon. And there have been a lot of questions about how sustainable and whether these business models have been made to last, and what we should be doing a little differently. And should we be exploring new innovations, or should we be also looking at some of the old and trusted models, such as fiber, mobile, and others that are already in the space? And what should regulators and policymakers do to ensure that there's competition, but then there's investment for growth? So to discuss this with me, I've got a very, very enlightened panel. I have with me Steve Song. Steve is a policy advisor for Mozilla, and but he's a very knowledgeable person on many, I think he wears many hats, so this is a very modest title for him. And we also have Aminata Amadou-Garba. She's a senior technology coordinator for the ITU. And then we have Josephine Miliza. Josephine is the Africa Regional Coordinator for APC. So we're going to start this discussion with Steve. I'd like Steve, you to bring in, just set the scene for us on what we're seeing in terms of connectivity and last mile connectivity generally, and what we should be looking at. Over to you, Steve.
Thanks, Eleanor, and good afternoon and good morning to everyone. Because we have a limited amount of time for opening remarks, I've chosen to focus on one technology in particular, and that is the role of fiber optic technology. Next slide, please. As Eleanor pointed out, the growth in internet penetration is slowing. So in this graph, you can see in the blue bars, the percentage of users per 100 people around the world. And you see that while it's going up, that going up is tapering off. And that's illustrated by the other part of that graph, which is the red and orange there, which indicates the year-on-year growth. And we see that growth is slowing. And what that tells us, I think, is that the current models and technologies we have to connect the world are not enough. We need new business models, new technologies, and new mechanisms for financing to achieve access for all. Next slide, please. And in particular, that challenge relates to urban areas where, increasingly we don't see a north-south divide in terms of the digital divide, but more of an urban-rural access divide. And developing strategies that are going to enable rural access are key to solving that problem. Excuse me. Next slide, please. And the way that I and many of my colleagues see the challenge, I want to explain with this metaphor, which is if you can think of telecommunications as access as a glass jar that you're trying to fill with fist-sized stones, you can probably fit about 3 or 4 stones into that jar, and it looks full. But if you fill that jar with water, you discover that still more than 50% of it by volume is empty. And that sort of roughly describes the telecommunications landscape we find ourselves in now, that the markets can accommodate, 3 or 4 national telecommunications providers, and then no more. It's simply not practical to have, dozens of national providers. And so we run into a challenge, especially in delivering access to poor areas, to rural areas. And I believe the key is to unlock the regulatory and investment environment for smaller operators. And that's what you see in the middle there, is that smaller operators can be more fit for purpose to local environments, can operate on lower overheads, can design technologies that are more appropriate to specific contexts in which they find themselves. And indeed, not just commercial operators, but non-commercial operators, ranging from cooperatives to community networks, to other forms of shared network access, community-owned access that addresses the challenge of affordable access to internet in a non-commercial way. And so how does all that relate to the technology I want to talk about, which is fiber optic technology? Well, let's find out. So next slide, please. So this is a picture of undersea fiber optic telecommunications capacity in 2009. There was one cable, the Sat3 cable, and it was owned by a cartel, and it was more expensive than satellites. Fast forward, next slide, to the current world, and we see a dramatic change. Now a design capacity of 728 terabits per second coming online in the next couple of years. It is a phenomenal change, and it's not, it's not as sexy as satellites, and it's not as noticeable as a handset in your hand, because this is under the water, and perhaps not as visible. Next slide, please. And those undersea cables have spurred a huge investment in terrestrial fiber optic infrastructure. So over 1 million kilometers of terrestrial fiber across the continent in the last 10 years. This is quite astounding. And why it's astounding is because fiber optic technology is a technology of a different order from other kinds of technologies. Next slide, please. So if you look, on the left-hand side, these are proportional dots. If you look at the tiny dot on the left-hand side, that's twisted pair technology, which is good for about 100 megabits per second. And then you get microwave technologies, which are good for about 2 gigabits per second, or going up to millimeter wave. Some of you may have heard of Teragraph, supported by Facebook. New technologies which are associated with 5G, about 40 gigabits per second. But fiber optic infrastructure is a horse of a different color. It's an orders of magnitude different capacity, which means that not only are you connected to a technology that puts you only milliseconds away from anywhere else on the internet, but you have what is essentially a non-rival technology. It's technology that can be shared by many without crowding out other competitors, which means maybe we should be thinking about it a little bit differently. So how does this play out? Let's have a next slide. Let's have a look at Kenya. And this is a map that shows some of the major fiber optic networks in Kenya. The National NOFB network, Liquid Telecom Kenya, JTL. There's a couple missing, but the point here that I want to make is that the cost is not the same across these networks. So, and this is anecdotal evidence. So, in Nairobi a couple of years ago, if you're a wholesale operator, you could get access to wholesale broadband for about $2 per megabit per second. But if you were up country and you want to buy access to the network, well, the price is very, very different. Might be closer to $70 per megabit per second. These are approximations, but they are not, they're pretty much in line with what we see in many countries, where the cost in the capital is dramatically different from the cost that we see in rural areas. And what does that mean? That means if you're a small operator, the only place you can actually be a competitive small operator is in the capital. If you want to be a competitive small operator in the areas that need it most, you're challenged by this problem of the cost of access to backhaul in rural areas. Next slide, please. So here's an example of how this plays out. This is a cooperative in Northern England called Broadband for the Rural North, or BARN. They offer 1 gigabit symmetric fiber access to every household, every farmhouse that they connect. In an area that was deemed unprofitable by British Telecom, they managed to create a profitable model. But the only way they were able to do it is by actually building their own fiber route, while actually leasing their own dark fiber to get to an IXP. Now, an IXP, or Internet Exchange Point, it's the watering holes of the internet. It's this place where everyone can go and share access to a resource, and it's where the prices are lowest for access to the internet. So if you can get to an IXP, your costs are dramatically lower. But not many countries have the luxury of having multiple IXPs in the country. Many only have one in the capital city. Next slide, please. So this is a problem I have been reflecting on for many years. It is a fundamental challenge. As the demand for broadband increases, the cost of access to backhaul becomes the critical barrier to enabling that service delivery. And I have to thank my colleague Jim Forster for pointing out this analogy, that this problem existed once before in a different kind of internet, which was the postal system. And in the early 1800s, if you wanted to post a letter, it was charged by distance, by the number of sheets. It was a complex calculation that was formulated every time you wanted to post a letter, meaning that that the traffic in letters was somewhat limited, and that it excluded those who could least afford it. Well, this is Roland Hill. He was a school teacher, and he became convinced that there was a better way of doing it. And he proposed a single price for sending a letter. And that was the first postage stamp, the penny black. And what happened was, in 1 year after introducing this postage stamp of a single price, the number of letters posted in the UK more than doubled. And then again, within 10 years. So this one innovation of having a single price for postage completely democratized access to the postal system. And there's some very interesting research on the full economic impact of these issues. But, and I think this is something we could learn from for broadband. Next slide, please. And happily, as the science fiction writer William Gibson has said, you know, the future is already here, it's unevenly distributed. This is exactly what a wholesale fiber optic network provider in New Zealand is doing. This is Chorus, and they've offered a service called Edge Connect, which connects you virtually to a peering point anywhere in New Zealand. And that means if you're a small ISP, if you're a cooperative, suddenly you pay the same price no matter where you are to connect to the fiber optic backbone. I think this is transformative. I think if we want to connect rural areas, we want to see one price for access no matter where you are in the country. And indeed, that's not the only example. National research and education networks like TENET in South Africa offer one price to universities. No matter where you are in South Africa as a university, you pay the same price, whether you're in a rural area or you're in Johannesburg or Cape Town. Anyway, I want to leave you with that one thought before we launch into those conversations. So thank you very much. And I look forward to my, my co-presenters.
Well, thank you very much, Steve. That was a very, very enlightening presentation, actually, and to see that, I knew there were disparities between urban and rural areas when it comes to the cost, but it's very staggering to see it actually in figures, where you pointed out in Nairobi, and also to see that there are innovative ways ensuring that there is better harmonization and equity across board through the connecting to backhaul in a way that can be more equitable across board. So good to see that example as well. So Aminata, you've just heard Steve give some of the the potential for fiber and also why it's important for us to look at how backhaul can be more equitably distributed and also last mile connectivity as well. What are your thoughts coming from the ITU, and what have you seen? What are the trends that you've seen from the ITU?
Thank you very much, Eleanor, for this introduction. And thank you, Steve, for this great presentation. So I will be talking also about last mile connectivity solutions. I will focus a little bit on some policy aspect of the last mile connectivity. In the next slide, please. So here, I think this is kind of joining what Steve has said earlier, the motivation behind this discussion and all the discussions and the work behind that last mile connectivity gap. It's because there is really a gap. Today, we have about 50% of the world connected, and we still have half of the world unconnected. And we see a big gap between rural and area. One positive note on that, though, is that the youth appear to be more connected. And looking at how we are having young population in some region, for example, in Africa, this is a good news, but we still have to find ways to connect the half of the world which is unconnected. And most of these people are living in least developed countries and also in rural areas. So next slide, please. Here I wanted to discuss a little bit some of the components of a sustainable last mile connectivity. So there are many of them, and I will go a little bit deeper in some of them, but I wanted to start discuss between the difference between financial viability and affordability. We believe that the reason why some of the people in the rural areas are not connected is because the connectivity is not affordable to them. And one other reason is that because the infrastructure is not available in those regions as well. And the infrastructure is not available because some of the providers do not feel that they get a return on investment fast enough to go in these regions. So when we look at that, they are basically looking at the financial viability of the provider. And I think this is also, there is a lot of room for discussion whether it's financial viable or not. But some providers will think that going in some regions, it wouldn't be financial viable for the business model they do have. And the financial viability is really like the service provider point of view, whether or not they will break even or they get the profit they want to get. But I think that what we at the ITU, and then a lot of people also at Alliance for Affordable Internet are also looking at is, how do we make this affordable while still having this financial viability? Because it's important, whoever is there to provide the service must break even, and that even if it's not for profit, they still need to be able to maintain the network. So while financial viability is very important, it must be coupled with affordability. And affordability now is on the point of view of the user to see, is the user able to pay for this? So whatever is the ARPU, which makes it financially viable for the provider, is this affordable for the user? And I think sometimes these calculations are not done at the same time, and that's why we sometimes get in places where you have a provider who can be viable, but the service is not affordable, or a service affordable, but the provider won't be viable and must close the shop. So I think this is one key point we have to consider when we want to see a sustainable solution for the last mile connectivity. Next slide, please. In this slide here, we're looking at more components for sustainable last mile connectivity solutions. So beside the affordability, and one point also I wanted to emphasize also, affordability has most of the time been looked at a bigger picture. So when we look at the Broadband Commission 2% affordability rate, for example, usually we calculate this using the GDP of the country. And the GDP of the country is definitively not the GDP of the people living in the rural area. So how can we make sure that when we look at affordability, we get to the granularity to the people who are actually living in these rural areas? So if to come back here, in addition to the affordability and the financial viability, additional things must be taken into account. And if we look at this picture, which is from Claire Mine, we will see that she started this study by saying that actually everything started from the regulatory influences. Even the affordability, even the financial viability, or the other sustainability keys, all of them can be influenced by regulations and policies. So really this slide is saying, while all these components are important, the key aspect of this will be policy and regulations, because policy and regulations can try to impact the affordability. And one way of doing it, I will see later, is via subsidies, for example. If the service must be there and it's not affordable, are there subsidies for people who are providing the solutions so that they be viable? If service is there and it's not affordable, are there subsidies for people who are using it? But subsidies is not always the solution. Sometimes it's just giving incentives for people to come and then provide the services and make the services available to people. And also some incentives. We have seen cases where the service is not affordable because you are asking to people to pay in front a lot of money. But if the service is provided in such a way that it is divided into chunks and then people are able to take it and use it based on the income they have, it may be more affordable. So all of these mechanisms can be influenced by the policy and the regulations. So next slide, please. Here, these are some examples of policy interventions which we have actually selected from real case studies submitted to the ITU. And in these case studies, we have looked at what are the specific interventions, policy interventions or regulations which have allowed to have some efficiency in the market, and then to allow people more access to the connectivity. And I'm not going through them, but I will cite some of them. For example, some of them is to allow community networks or small operators to have an affordable license in order to be able to bridge the gap where other people are not going. So when in places where other people are not going, how can we make sure that those small operators who are willing to go there can afford to go there? So that's also a point which policy can bridge. Another policy interventions we have seen is spectrum licensing cost, which is usually very high. So in rural regions and other places also, are there interventions which can allow these people to have access to policy, to spectrum, and then provide some affordable connectivity? Tax incentives are also some of the interventions which have been cited in these case studies. And we have actually a whole list of case studies, about, I think, 100 and something of them. I will share a link a little bit later. So if we go in the next slide, this is also some other examples of policy interventions like subsidy. As I said, financial intervention is also an intervention, is not always the solution. It may not be even sometimes the most efficient solution, but it can be a solution sometimes to allow just to start this projects, which sometimes you have entrepreneurs, you have small operators, you have local people. It's really a way to sometimes incentivize the local people to come and then take into their own hands the connectivity of the regions. And sometimes the ideas are there, but then the financing is not there. Then can countries, can regulations, and can government help to these people to start the project and then to make it happen. And I think the next is my last slide, is about some of the trade-off of subsidies which can exist, where the first area here, this is actually a slide from the ITU toolkit, regulation toolkit. And this slide is interesting, I think, because it's showing that in most of the cases, you actually don't need to go to the subsidy. It's policy and regulation adjustment. The policy and regulation adjustment are enough to allow the feasibility of the project and to allow to have a sustainable solution. Now, you will go only to the subsidy in places where you think that the policy and regulations are not enough. And in that case, you can have, and in that subsidy also, it must be smart subsidy, because the subsidy cannot be sustainable at the long run. But can we have some smart way to allow people to jumpstart the project and then to keep them sustainable? And I will stop here, and we'll continue the discussion through the questions later. Thank you, Eleanor. Back to you.
Thank you so much, Aminata. That was so insightful. I mean, I was just listening to the point you made about the trade-off between financial viability and affordability. The point you made about that GDP is not really reflective of economics in rural areas. We also do measure affordability here. That's what our name says, and so there's a lot of work that needs to be done in that space. But very, very important point about the regulations and policy in ensuring that we see more better investments, and also ensuring that those investments actually do go to get people connected in an affordable manner. So thank you for bringing those really important points up. And then I know that both you and Steve spoke about the importance of smaller operators and community networks. So I'm moving on to Josephine now, who has extensive work. She's done extensive work with community networks. So she can speak a little bit more about last mile connectivity with a special focus on community networks. Josephine.
Thank you, Eleanor, and thank you so much to Steve and Aminata, who set quite a good pace and groundwork for presentation around the small operators. My focus today will be around community networks who are not-for-profit commercial operators. Next slide, please. So in trying to understand the last mile connectivity options, which ones are viable, which ones are sustainable, it's key that we also understand the offline population. And one of the differentiating factors around connecting the second half is that unlike the first half, which you are connecting people who are more educated, had more income or disposable income, we are really looking into communities or population that have lower income, lower education, and also live in rural areas where it's not just connectivity or telecom infrastructure gaps that they face, but they also have other limited or lack of access to supporting infrastructure, such as electricity. And so what community networks seek to address is to look at the granularity of these challenges that the community faces and trying to create solutions that are actually localized and are able to meet not just telecommunication gaps, but also other issues. So trying to understand what community networks are is that they are networks built by communities, and it's not the first time that we are seeing the citizen-driven models. We've seen it in other sectors, such as the cooperative model in the financial sector or in the agricultural sector. And so whereas it's new in the, or sort of new in the telecom space, there's actually lots that can be borrowed and learned in terms of making this more viable for the telecom space. Institutionally, the models vary from one community to another because there are different socio-cultural contexts. And so in some areas, we find they are not-for-profit organizations. Others, we find they are CBOs. And also in other areas, we find that they are cooperatives. In Africa, we see that there are 22 community networks. The movement is actually growing, and they are in 15 countries, and they adopt what we call like a holistic approach to connectivity, which is that they look at other underlying factors that other underlying factors such as internet, not just affordability and access, but also the ability of people to go online and contribute or use it in a way that they find valuable. The next couple of slides, I'll be sharing some of the initiatives that we see here in some of the examples of community networks in Africa. Yes, and the first one is BOSCO Uganda. In full, BOSCO Uganda means battery operated systems for community outreach, and it's a community network located in northern Uganda. The organization of the community network has its roots in the Catholic Church, and it was formed during the civil war that was happening in Uganda in the early 2000s. And it was just difficult for the people to move from one place to another. And so the network was created as a way to promote connection or communication during that time. They started off with VoIP, which is voice over IP and internet services, and were mostly targeting the IDP camps. But as people now resettled back into the villages, BOSCO now moved from that and now went to connect the people who had resettled. In terms of how the network operates, still on BOSCO, in terms of how the network operates is that they use unlicensed spectrum. And one of the remarkable things about BOSCO is that the building of supporting infrastructure, which is electricity. Research done found that about 4 in 10 Africans lack access to electricity connection. And so when we're talking about building a telecom infrastructure, which is highly reliant on electricity, and yet most of the offline population live in rural areas, there's also need to be able to address this gap. And so BOSCO has been able to build large solar plants. They have one 6 kilowatt and two 30 kilowatt that not just provide power to the equipment, but also connect schools as well as surrounding businesses. Next slide, please. Yes, and the next example of a community network is PamojaNET, and it's championed by an organization called Deepens, and it's located in DRC in an island called Idri. Idri has a population of about 300,000 people, and the network actually was initiated by an invitation from the island king, who approached La Difference in a way for them to think on how they can be able to bring connectivity so that there are more opportunities for youth in the island. And so similar to BOSCO and many other community networks, they also utilize the Wi-Fi and licensed spectrum, but they're also starting to experiment with GSM for SMS and voice services. And this is informed by the fact that majority of the people in the island don't have access to smartphones, but the island also has very limited access to voice and SMS services. They have worked their way in terms of sustainability. So 60% of the monthly operations for the network are actually funded through local businesses. And we see quite a good synergy there because during the day, the local businesses use the internet, and then they have off-peak hours where the community members can use the internet for free. Another interesting thing about PamojaNET has been the development of locally relevant platforms, which is a gap that is experienced by many. And they use a human-centered design approach to design up to the local communities. And one example of this is an application called Salama. Salama in Swahili means safe, which was created as an emergency response services to enable users or people in the community raise an alarm for help from family or friends in case of an attack. Next slide, please. And lastly, it's Zenzeleni Community Network, and this is the first cooperative-owned ISP in South Africa. It's located in rural Eastern Cape. The network has grown to have about 60 hotspots and connect 11 businesses. The interesting thing about Zenzeleni is always around their two-tier model, because one of the gaps we see with local communities is the ability to, getting the skills that are relevant to operate and manage a network. And so Zenzeleni has a two-tier model. It has Zenzeleni not-for-profit, which provides support to the cooperatives that now run the network. Last year during COVID-19, one of the challenges that was experienced in communities was that the information that was being given, most of the interventions first, they were largely online, and then information was mostly in English and not in the local language. So Zenzeleni translated COVID-19 responses, resources, and other health practices in the local language. And then they made it available on the network that is 0 rating. Next slide. And so with that, whereas we see that since 2016, there has been growth in terms of the movement in Africa, there are still challenges that these community-based initiatives face. And one of them is around the licensing challenges. And in most countries, license categories exist for national operators, and they are also very costly. We find that very few countries in Africa recognize community networks. And so in trying to exist in this regulated space. Community networks find themselves in a difficult situation because the key thing to operating any network is being recognized by the licensing framework. Apart from that, there are challenges with regards to spectrum, licensing and fees. Majority of them utilize Wi-Fi, both for access and backhaul, but it's because that is what is available and also affordable at this time. And the challenge being that for most of the parties that spectrum assignments are done nationally and they are quite expensive for these small operators to be able to afford. The last challenge that I'd like to discuss today is around limited access to funding. And as I shared before, is that they operate in what is commonly known a market for the base of the pyramid. And so trying to look at innovative business models that can be profitable or at least sustainable is quite challenging because they are really building the market from ground up. So this makes it difficult for them to be able to access funding, whether it is loans, and also because of the fact that they are not recognized by the regulators, they are not, they don't qualify for the Universal Service Access Fund. Next slide, please. Yes, so to conclude, it's just around policy recommendations that we have. And the first one is around financing mechanisms. It will be great if, especially for the Universal Service Fund, there will be dedicated funds to support these networks, but also looking into private funding, the ones that investors who can fund into early stage type of initiatives. We also recommend financing strategies that are focused on collaboration and coordination between public operation agencies as well as NGOs. Another recommendation is in terms of developing an inclusive licensing and spectrum framework. And we are seeing this is slowly gaining momentum in Africa with some of the regulators looking at how they can be able to create this environment for community networks. And it can take different shapes. One can be the creation of specific licenses for community networks, license exemptions, since administrative burdens that come with being a licensed operator are also quite horrendous. Then in terms of spectrum, it can also be maybe expanding license exempt Wi-Fi bands because this is the one that is majorly used by community networks, as well as advocating for efficient use of spectrum by creation and implementations of mechanisms that allow for spectrum sharing. Lastly is around capacity building, and being that they mostly operate in rural areas, and also because of challenges with regards to funding, getting the right local skills is quite a challenge for community networks. And so what would help is if there will be funding that supports this type of capacity building, that focuses on building the community's knowledge and skills that will allow them to participate in the deployment and running of this particular network. And so the skills vary from not just the technical work, which is like the deployment of the infrastructure and the management of it, of the infrastructure, but also business case development, financial analysis, as well as other social economic factors. That brings me to the end of my presentation. I look forward to engaging further.
Thank you so much, Josephine. And you nailed it with those examples of, I mean, a real balance between viability and affordability with the examples you mentioned of community networks, PamojaNET, Zinzeleni, I can see that they've been trying to balance the two, providing affordable service to the community, but also ensuring that they are viable with the commercial arrangements as well. There's been a lot of conversation about the rural broadband, rural areas as well, because these are very critical areas if we really want to achieve universal access. And I just wanted to do a plug-in for some work that we did with partners, APC, with Facebook, with the Digital Empowerment Foundation. And it's called the Rural Broadband Policy Framework, which brings together a number of elements that are very critical if we want to build a policy framework for the rural areas. And I think that we should share that, Michael, because then it gives a good sense of, and all the elements that we've captured: licensing, regulations, inclusive, very inclusive regulation, investment. All these parts are all captured in the Rural Broadband Policy Framework. So back to you, Steve. We've listened to all these conversations, and one thing that keeps coming through is about the issue of collaboration and investments. And I want to find out from you, from your experience, what are the challenges with scaling, successfully proven solutions for last mile connectivity?
Well, I think part of it is we may be thinking about it the wrong way, in that we may be assuming that the end game for a small ISP is to become a gigantic ISP. And perhaps that isn't the case, right? Perhaps it is perfectly reasonable to assume that just as we have a thriving SME environment in other sectors, why should there not also be in the telecommunications sector? And I think there's certain kinds of capital that actually thwart that aim. So for instance, venture capital, which, at the end game of venture capital is to become massively profitable. Well, for rural areas, I mean, there is no massively profitable. There is no solution there that that leads to that outcome. So that kind of funding, I think, is actually unhelpful for rural access. Patient capital, the kind of financing, for instance, that Jim Forster's group does in terms of providing small loans to ISPs to allow them to expand, to develop their business, to grow organically. I think, recognizing, using the same mechanisms we've used to support small business in other sectors and bringing it into this area. But at the same time, also recognizing that a for-profit model is not the only approach that's going to work. I think one of the great examples of a not-for-profit broadband model we can see in many countries on the continent, and that is in the national research and education networks like KNET in Kenya, TENET in South Africa, and numerous others. Those are universities that have banded together to share the cost of access in a way that doesn't seek to become profitable, but seeks to serve the ends of those universities, which is high-speed access to broadband. Municipalities, towns can follow the same model, as can cooperatives. So we need financing that also recognizes that, and that kind of financing, it can be very innovative, right? It doesn't necessarily have to be a cash infusion. In many countries, to invest in a cooperative gives you a tax break. Right, so you can actually you can interest the wealthy in the country in investing in cooperatives simply by making it attractive from a tax perspective to actually put their money into something like a cooperative. In the realm of financing, there is a host of innovations going on around the world in terms of community-owned infrastructure financing that I think is untapped in terms of research. And I would love to see more publication of these models and more collecting and analysis of them.
Yeah. So Steve, just on that same point, then, why then is it? Why has it been difficult for some of these models to be successful? If it's financing is, I mean, are we saying that financing is not a problem? Then Why, for instance, if you take Project Loon, why was it a failure then? And you know, was financing the cost, the real cost of it, or was there something else?
Well, I think in the case of Project Loon, the technology simply wasn't fit for purpose. If the intent of Project Loon was to provide affordable rural access, a business that, you know, at its basic operating model consumes hundreds of millions of dollars a year is going to be, you know, fundamentally undermined in terms of creating a kind of sustainable model. You know, those overheads were never going to be covered by, you know, northern Mozambique or in northern Kenya, where their partnerships existed. In the end, Loon was a very, very technologically driven project, right? It was, you know, it was a very, very interesting, still is a very interesting technological innovation. But I think, you know, we need to ground these innovations more locally, right? We need to ground them in the you know, the local experience of the communities that they're intended to serve.
That's a very great point about, you know, making sure that we are localizing a lot of these innovations, and also ensuring that there's a partnership between existing successful models of providers and these new models coming in. So to you, Aminata, you know, we've had a lot of conversations about policy and regulations, and the ITU has been working with a lot of governments on the issues of policy and regulations. How can countries ensure that they have the better investment climate to attract new innovations? And what should they be doing really specifically to tackle the issue of regulations and policy?
Well, thank you. This is a very difficult question. And indeed, ITU has been working with governments, with regulators for a long time. And I think a lot of progress, a lot of successes have been noticed in terms of policy and regulation. Now, I think maybe what government can do in addition, and I think they're already doing it, so maybe I'm repeating myself. I think it's to get maybe more prepared and then to have really a kind of a view of what they expect to attend. We know that countries have the strategies of national broadband strategies and so on and so forth. But sometimes to attract the investors, you need to show them maybe some more details about these policies and strategies. Do they have, I think one thing which can be interesting is that, can they look at maybe the country and then say, we know all where the gaps are? And this is something we are working on at the ITU, and we hope that we can help some of the countries to do that, is to really make a diagnostic and saying, well, first of all, we know, and I know that a lot of work Steve has been also working on the mapping, really mapping and saying, we know where the gap are. Everywhere is the gap, we know, and then we will be able to update it as we go. But knowing the gap is not enough, is maybe to say, now that we know where the gap are, and we know who are these populations where the gap is, can we now come up with strategies which are within that population? So really now, again, going a little bit to the local, not looking at the country-wide, saying we want 2% of the GDP, but we know that this population is not connected. We know that this population, the income is $100. So if we want to reach this affordability gap, we need a solution which is less than $2 a month, for example, because that is the target for this local population. And we also know that this local population, what they want is agriculture, is education. So we will provide them this connectivity with these applications just for them to do the need they want. But we are not going to provide them solutions and applications which are not useful for them, and then a solution which is very expensive, which they won't pay. So I think now, for me, I think the next step is going a little bit into the granularity, so that I think Olu just mentioned it, is rolling out the regulations at the local level. So I think we have a lot been looking at the country level. Now maybe let's go a little bit deeper to the local level, the investment at the local level, what it takes for this locality to be connected. What are the solutions they need? What is the bandwidth requirements? If these the solutions they need, maybe they don't need a very sophisticated connectivity. Therefore, we can provide a solution which is really fit for their need, and also which is affordable for their need. And I think this is a next step in, and I think it's something which has been already done and which is being done, but maybe it's something we will focus a little bit more on. Back to you.
I'm glad that the ITU is looking at localizing regulations, because in our line of work at A4AI, we work very closely with governments, civil society, and private sector in various countries. And it's, you know, for instance, if you take issues of right-of-way issues, you can look at it at the national level, but a lot of the decision-making is done at the municipal and metro levels, where you need to have alignments between various states and regions to ensure that they can be, you know, harmonized rates for the cost of fiber and for infrastructure. And so if we are not able to localize those kinds of regulations and policies, it makes it more expensive and we can't meet the affordability goal. So I won't see how we can perhaps do a lot more work in that space to ensure that we can get more local governors and senators or people at the municipal level, decision makers, taking greater action in that space. So moving on to you, Josephine, we've had all this discussion about partnerships. How can community networks and also last mile innovators get more out of public-private partnerships? What should they be doing to make sure that they are more attractive and they can offer better value in those relationships?
I think there's also another way of looking at it. It's not just like for community networks to position themselves in a way that they are more attractive. I think it should be also from the private investors, as some that Steve mentioned, or private investments, to sort of like look into investing in the community networks. We see that just from the presentation that or the examples that I shared around the existing community networks, is that they are not just addressing the infrastructure gap. And so when you talk about local communities deploying the network, then there's the aspect of local creation of employment. There's the development of the applications themselves, which are relevant and support local businesses. In terms of like the solar plants, for example, they are filling a gap that national governments or
Hello, Josephine, can you hear me? We lost you briefly.
Hello?
Yeah, I can hear you now. Yes, you can hear you now. Yes.
Okay, sorry. Yes, so I was saying that community network seeing not just like the connectivity or the infrastructure gap. And from the examples that I shared around, it can be the filling gap, for example, in northern Uganda, where there's solar plants which provide electricity beyond powering of infrastructure. There is also the creation of employment through skilling the local youth who operate and manage the network. So in terms of investments, I think, especially for these initiatives, is looking beyond the traditional investors in the telecom space to maybe investors who are looking into employability issues, investors who are looking, for example, into agri-tech or health information systems and how they integrate with community networks or with ICT. So I see it more of not just like zeroing into, you know, like the traditional way of how telecom infrastructure has been funded, to opening it up to how the application of the internet is in terms of the socio-economic empowerment to these communities. And so I would like maybe to see more investors or the donors or funders who are looking into issues such as youth employability in rural areas, e-commerce in terms of agriculture, health systems, supporting these networks because they actually complement the work that they are doing.
That's a great point, actually, about broadening the scope of you know, how where we approach investments and looking at those who are able to offer complementary services to community networks. So we have a lot of questions that have come up in the chat. So I think I'll start with the questions I see from the bottom as I try to scroll up. The first question is about diagnosis. So I think it will come to you, Aminata. There's a question about, you know, how long is this diagnosis going to take, you know, so that we can, you know, in order to ensure that we're able to give people affordable connectivity. So Aminata, what do you say to that?
Well, thank you for the question. I'm not sure how long it will take, but I think it's something which can be done pretty quickly because we have a lot of information available. So can we gather the information, look at the information and try to come up with some diagnostic? I don't know the timeline, but I will say it shouldn't take a lot of time. Let's say it could be done in the upcoming maybe months or a few years, but I think it's something, maybe not years. I think it should be done quickly enough. Let's say like that.
And I know, Steve, you're also a big, you know, proponent of ensuring that if there are data gap, there's data, it has to be open, right? You know, you've been championing a lot about data on say the number of towers that countries have and how connectivity is across the country. So perhaps you could say something about that whilst I look at the other questions that are coming in.
Sure. I think the interesting insights we're gaining from what we know about telecommunications infrastructure comes from combining different data sets together to bring new insights. Just as in the discussion, it's been mentioned Facebook's investment in research on the impact of telecommunications infrastructure, fiber optic infrastructure. That research was only possible because the fiber optic maps were open data. And, you know, for instance, the GSMA published their mobile coverage maps, but because that data is not open to be recombined with, say, fiber data or socioeconomic data, we are limited in the insights that we can derive from that data. So having open data policies around telecommunications is just a good idea for everybody in terms of that diagnosis.
Yeah, and I don't know if we have GSMA on this call, but it would, I mean, they're a member of the A4AI, so this is something that I feel we could be able to engage them on, see how we can get that data a lot more in supportive formats that we could also use in other spaces. There's also a question about not, you know, the idea of not looking at subsidies to support the last mile. You know, is there clarity on the other options, Aminata? I think it comes back to you again. If we don't look at subsidies, what other, I know you mentioned some other examples, perhaps you could just reiterate that.
Yeah, sure. So I think subsidy can be used, but the idea of that slide, which is from the ITU regulation toolkit, is that it should not be the first solution. It's only in places where you have tested other regulations and policies, then you can look at subsidies. There may be places where you may not have the choice but subsidize. And in that case, I think regulations should also look at the option. However, the message is that this should not be the first solution to look at. Now, other solutions exist. In many cases, telecommunication sector, the digital sector is a privatized sector. So I think we cannot do without the private sector. If you give incentive enough to private sector to come and make the connectivity, build the infrastructure, provide the service, break even, but making sure also that this is affordable to the population, I think this is a win-win situation. Can we give incentives? We have seen tax incentives from Kenya, for example. We have seen some of the regulations where the license is zero cost. So that people, the service provider, can go in those rural areas without paying a huge cost for the license. They will put the money in the infrastructure. So I think it's really working in partnership. Governments cannot do it by themselves. They can do the policy and regulation, but I think they can really work with the people who have the technical abilities and who really are doing it for the job to go and then do that. But what are the incentives they can do them? They can give them and then talk with them, having really this collaborative, I think this is a term we use at the ITU, having these collaborative regulations, not one-sided regulation. I think that can help.
Speaking of collaboration, I just wanted to ask you, Josephine, what has been the experience between, for community networks when they approach the regular or big operators? What's been the rapport and what kind of, what has been the reaction from regulators to the kind of relationships you have with existing operators?
In terms of the reception from regulators, I think there's a lot of work that has gone into building awareness on community networks. From the onset, there wasn't that much awareness on how these models would fit in the market structure. That was mostly for commercial and not for profit type of organizations. And so I would say, like, for example, organizations like APC and ISOC have been engaging with regulators from the different areas. So IACO in East Africa, WATRA in West Africa, as well as the southern parts of Africa. And slowly we are seeing small wins here and there in terms of recognition from regulators. So for example, in Uganda, there is a communal license for community networks. Kenya right now is in the process of creating such a framework. So more needs to be done. I think there is more should be focused on sort of from that other side, understanding this type of models, that they are a viable model if supported, similar to other sectors that have had successes with SMEs.
But what about with operators? Has their rapport been good between like MNOs and the community networks?
I haven't experienced that, but I would say in some areas or in some countries, it's not been so welcoming. And yeah, so I guess there's also need to be, like, the awareness is not just for the regulator, but also for the other operators to understand community networks, not as a competitor, but as a complementary partner.
Right, thank you. So we just have about 5 minutes more to go. So we'll just be wrapping up. I think most of the questions have been answered in the chat as well. So we're just coming back to the last sets of questions, and I'll start with you, Steve. So, you know, what advice would you give to firms, tech firms, and new entrants who want to enter into the last mile connectivity space?
Ooh, you saved the tough questions for last. I think, you know, you want to look for a predictable regulatory environment, right? You want to be able to have confidence that you have a regulator who has your back in terms of, you know, the build out and development of your business. And I think there are some regulators that do that better than others. I think, you know, for small operators, you know, not planning to take over the world too soon is good advice. So there are lots of examples of great small operators across the continent. You know, there's Habari Node in Arusha that operates now 200 kilometers of fiber in Arusha, but they started with 1 kilometer, right? You know, and they, you know, I think that understanding your market and growing, you know, in a measured way is not a terrible idea. And when you have thousands of operators doing that, then you actually see growth at scale, but it's scale that is made up of many small parts as opposed to something that's monolithic.
Thank you very much, Steve. And Aminata, the same question to you as well. I don't know if you can hear me, but
yes.
What advice would you give to companies, yes, and you know, and to governments as well who want to attract investments for last mile connectivity?
So I agree with Steve. It's a hard question for the end, but I think all the operators, for profit or not for profit, and government included, so all the people who are in this business of providing that connectivity and a meaningful connectivity, as we like calling it, I think first of all, they should not be hesitant to go to places which they think are not, will not maybe provide to them a rapid return on investment. These rural areas and these places which are still to be connected are really potential. I think the key is to look at the adapted solutions. We need to look at the business, the regulations, and the technologies which fit those places, go with them, and I think everybody who will go there will be successful, but by really adapting, customizing the need of these places and go through them, go with that. So I think my message is the same for the government and also for the providers, be them big or small providers, profit or not for profit. Thank you.
Thank you. So I can see the same trends coming through. Regulations and policy, very important. Look at the kind of investments, localized solutions as well. So what about you, Josephine? You've been working very closely with some of these, you know, operators and last mile solution providers. What kind of advice would you give to new ones coming into the space? And if you have the ear of government, what would that advice be?
My advice would be similar to what Steve mentioned: dream big, start small. There's value in starting small because there's a lot of dynamics, especially social cultural, that go into starting operating a community network initiative because of how granular and localized the solutions are. And so most are starting in areas where, you know, like you might maybe get advice or information around technology, which is usually like the simplest part of community networks, but really the the social engineering, understanding the human relationships, building trust, knowing which local resources are available and how you can be able to utilize those, building capacity. Those are actually issues that take time. And so time and patience. It's not something that will happen in a day or a year. It might take longer to get up, to get things going. For government, I think it's around support for this model for community networks. Really looking at having more inclusive licensing and spectrum sharing frameworks. There's a lot that actually comes from just, like having like a regulator recognize a community network. This makes a difference when, for example, you're fundraising with investors, because it means that they don't have the fear that they are going to invest in a model that maybe in 2-3 years, the government might decide to shut down. And also just looking more into the universal service access funds and how they can be used for this model. Recent, I would say, like previous experience, especially in the investment of this fund, has taken like a really top-down approach, and not most have been sustainable. And so I think it's time that policymakers and regulators also get to the ground and start working with people who are on the ground every day to understand more around where the investment needs to go in terms of funding, in terms of other support that government machinery has to offer.
Great. This conversation has been so insightful. I found it very, very, very useful. And I hope all of you who are listening, thank you so much for participating. I could see so much conversation going on in the chat. Was trying to manage, just trying to keep an eye on the speaking, and then also just trying to monitor what's going on in the chat. But I mean, what's very important is the things that have come through that, for private sector, there's a lot of opportunity there. There's still a lot of places that are unconnected. Of course, dream big, but start small, as you've heard from the various panelists. You need to localize actions. So making sure that the kind of technology that you're looking at is one that can be viable in the spaces that you want to go into. And then also great partnerships with existing providers and with newer ones as well. And also ensuring that there is better regulatory environment by governments. That's something governments have to take up. Policies will have to be forward-looking and one that is more inclusive. And then finally, there has to be greater collaboration and partnerships so that we can get the whole equilibrium between the viability of solutions, last mile connectivity solutions, as well as affordability for consumers. So it's been a pleasure to have moderated the session, and I'm very happy that you were all able to join. Thank you so much. We are going to post all the slides on our website, and we're also going to be sharing this video as well through our social media pages. And so thank you to Steve Song from Mozilla, to Josephine from APC, and then to Aminata from IITU.